It's my honor to be here this morning, and I'm thankful for the Niagara Foundation to host this lecture. I generally am used to talking to the Indian community in India and fairly large gatherings, and that has been my recent past, and for the simple reason because since about 5 years, my intellectual inputs to a government report called the Sachar Committee report opened up a floodgate of opportunities to interact with masses. And the reason why that happened was because I was talking about in that report about the social and economic and educational conditions of the largest minority in India, the Muslims. Today I'm going to share a few of the results of that committee, which is about 5-year-old, but I'm also going to share a bit about how the policy changes are taking place in India as a result of the report or the academic work which was undertaken through that committee. Now, before that, basically to give you a little bit of my introduction as to who I am, I belong to southern part of India. That's my birthplace called Bangalore. I was born in a rural part about 100 miles from Bangalore city. So in many respects, that was a very important attribute I had, that I could move around most part of the country undertaking massive surveys in my professional life and visiting a lot of rural and agriculture communities, spending a lot of time with them for many number of days and trying to understand the complexity what India is all about. India is a large country. It is a highly diverse country in geography. The mother nature is very different. We have Himalayas to deserts to forest areas and semi-arid regions to the food baskets such as Punjab and parts of southern India where we grow a lot of food. So we have huge diversity in terms of geography. But the diversity doesn't limit itself to geography, but there is a huge diversity in its own population. And historically, we have a huge number of ethnic populations. Our ethnic populations could be numbered more than 3,000. And then there is a larger community identified as the Hindu community. In no certain terms, one can define Hindus as one group of people, because there are hundreds and thousands of different castes and communities which differentiate this population. And at the same time, then we have about 20% of India's 1.2 billion population at the moment are considered as the minorities. And of this minority population, the largest minority, about 80–85% of the minority population are the Muslims, and then we have Christians, about 3–4%, and the Muslim constitute about 14% of India's population, which in terms of numbers are closer to about 180 million, next only to Indonesia as the largest Muslim concentration in the world are actually the Indian Muslims, and I'm one of them. I'm proud to be one of them. So the about 20 minutes time which I have, I will try to give you a kind of a sense of what India looks like today in terms of its economic growth, because India is known to. So I just move that one. Achieve what India is achieving, a fairly fast pace of economic growth. If you know, during your youth and your education, India probably was never counted as an economy which is worth listing. 30 years ago, India was considered as a very poor country, There was a lot of violent happenings at the time of independence. So basically, when my early professional life, when I used to visit a country like USA or other developed country, they would say, are they I mean, they would generally put a question, how many snake charmers are there in India? You know, that was the first question, because India was known as a land of snake charmers, right? But now, 20 years down the line, now India is considered one of the largest global economy, ranked 5th or 6th today in terms of the total size of the market. So here it is, a very quick summary. India has been growing fairly consistently since 1991. Particularly after early 2000, the growth has been much more higher and consistent. So the word is consistent growth, and we changed the course of growth from a low of 3% to somewhere around 5% in the early 2000, and closer to 7% in later part of 2000, and more recently, excepting last year, we were having a consistent growth rate of closer to 9%, and there was 1 year where we touched 10% growth rate. And a 10, 9, 10, 8% growth rate every year, you just imagine if we continue that growth for another 10 to 20 years, there is a very great hope that we will overcome a lot of deprivation in India, and that is the hope. So first, to overcome the deprivation, we need to have resources which are pooled together, and then those resources are taken over to the people, and that is the process of governance today we will talk about. So however, the medium term expectation is that we will grow 8% for next medium term is between 7 to 10 years. But most of that, a pointer here, most of that growth is because of domestic demand. Unlike China, which has a consistent 40 years of growth, most of Chinese growth occurred because of exports. So if you see last 10, 15 years, China was producing almost everything what the globe wanted in terms of manufacturing goods, you know, from toys to you take whatever. But however, India's growth, which is fairly consistent last 15 years, is mostly and largely because of domestic demand. So what it means is, so there is a slow growth in wealth of our households, of people. So these are very, very small amount of money. You know, I will show you as we go to next slide. There are a lot of poverty even today. So that poverty is so low, in the sense so mean, that poverty is measured in terms of how much of money you require to replenish about 2,400 kilocalories of nutrition in the body of a human being, which is about 30, 40 rupees, which is about say 50 cents, equivalent to Indian American dollar, right? So that is the level of poverty we have. Now, in spite of that level of poverty, a little bit of increase in growth is firing a huge market. Lot more children are going to school, they need books, they need pens and pencils, erasers, they need clothes, I mean they need some sort of transportation to transport them to the schools. We need to build more schools, so we need more bricks and more mortar and more cement and more steel. So you just see this small things which we need to put up our infrastructure, and there is a market growing, and that is what is happening all over India. Although there is no uniform growth in India, but growth is reaching out to nook and corners, and that was possible because of our savings and investments, and we are one of the next only to China. I don't know if anybody know what is the savings rate in India. In USA, the savings rate in India is closer to 35% of GDP. So we are so poor people, but we still save that little money, you know, and not all of us have bank accounts, but there are various different instruments of savings in the local market, and that is what is fueling growth in India. However, there is also an FDI, foreign direct investment. The money flows from a country like United States or UK or Japan. There is a consistent increase in FDI, and in fact, we have reached a stage where in last 5 years, the amount of FDI we received per year is more than the amount of FDI China received in the last. So, we overtook China in terms of FDI investment during the last 5 years. So, that means India has become a real a darling for the investors. Why? Because the rate of growth, the GDP growth and the rate of growth, the amount of money you make as profit is mind boggling. You know, in real terms, the rate of growth is not less than 20% in India. After you pay taxes and after you adjust for inflation, you definitely make somewhere around between 12 and 15% profits. Whereas, for example, in United States, I think it is very difficult to make a 3% profit at the moment. And Japan doesn't make any profit for any investment. It is closer to zero. Europe has its own problem, but the fact is it's one of the most favorite destination of the FDI. And that is happening only in last about 10 years. So, there is a possibility that the future growth of India will be equally contributed by the domestic demand and the domestic savings rate and the FDI which is coming. So, at the moment it is domestic demand higher and FDI is slowly increasing, and we will reach a place in maybe not very far from now, within 5-7 years, where FDI and domestic demand will be equally responsible to push up. So, what is happening is we have a virtuous economic growth which will take shape in this decade, because there is a global partnership. So, global money means global technology coming in. So, we will be improving our technology, and then we have a labor advantage. So, the virtuous combination of a technology and labor is what will give future growth to India. And that is why our fundamentals today, in spite of slowdown, our fundamentals are fairly firm, and they have 20 years of experience. And please believe me, and it is going to be a investment destination of the world. So, we have exports as well. So, now in spite of having that kind of situation, we still have, is there a pointer around here? No, that is okay. So, I can go there a little bit. So, you can see these bars. So, 1973, 2004 and 5. So, what you have is the poverty levels. So, when we were independent, 80% of our population were poor people. At that time, we were 400 million people. Out of 400 million people, about 320 or 300 and the indicator number in millions. So, actually that is 549. I think there is a little bit of percentage, I think that is, and the million numbers are not there here, but there used to be at the time of independence about 350 million people out of about 400 and odd million population were considered poor. Okay? So, 400 million people, about 80% of them were poor, and that number was about 350 million. Now, 60 years down the line, population has increased threefold. We have become 1.2 billion population, right? While the population has increased, our poverty has declined from very high levels of 80% to closer to 20%. So, do you see the geometric connection between the two? We have grown in population size and we have reduced the poverty levels, and that is what is the greatest thing which has happened in India. We still have 350 million poor people, but that is out of 1.2 billion population. Whereas at the time of independence, we had 300 million population to be poor, but that was only out of 400 million. You just see the ratios. So, that is the growth story of India, and this often we ignore. Often we consider India to be still poor, rightly so, but the fact is the kind of the broad based growth which has happened in such a way that the poverty levels have come down, and that is the growth story. And that poverty levels have come down as the GDP growth rate has grown up, and you see from middle point the GDP growth has started taking up. As the GDP growth is going down, and the poverty rates are falling down. So, there is a direct relationship between the growth and poverty, although we have not yet eliminated all the poverty. So, ultimately we need to eliminate poverty as soon as possible. Now, this is a kind of population, you would say a kind of pyramid. So, the bottom one are children, youth, and as you grow older, the population falls. But the more important is the line there which is drawn there, and that line is that is the age until when children should be in schools and colleges. But the problem which we have to overcome in India is to put all the eligible children into schools and colleges. So, at the moment there is a small triangle there within that. So, that triangle is the one that number of people are in schools and colleges, whereas the more probably about 60% of eligible children in different ages are out of schools and colleges in India. So, our efforts as we are developing growth to sustain that growth, the virtuous link between FDI and domestic demand which I was talking about, if we want to sustain that virtuous partnership, we need educated labor force. We can't build our nation by keeping our labor force lowly educated. So, we need to bring education up, and that is the mission, that is the challenge that our nation has, and that is the reason. And I have given you here a sort of inter-community these lines. This is education, how education is growing over a period of time from older period. This is 1965 to 2001. You see there is a slow increase in education, but still we have not achieved full literacy in India. But what has happened here is there are three different lines there: blue, green and red. So, the blue is the so called in quotes the better off population of India. These are the high caste groups. The red one is the Dalits and the low caste. You know, I told you about the diversity in India. They are low caste or outcasts. So, these were the Dalits. So, historically they were left out of schools and colleges and the development story. And the green one are the Muslims. So, if you go back to the historical literacy rates, you know, Muslims were having better literacy than the Dalits, but lower than the high caste in the past. So, as the literacy is growing, that means our the growth has to percolate down to all citizens of the nation. So, almost everybody is benefiting out of it. So, see the green line also going up, right. So, that means Muslims are also getting education, but at some stage last 10 years the Dalits who are below, they are catching up with the Muslims. In fact, the Dalit literacy rate is going above the green line and the green line is going down. You can see that over here. Okay. So, what that means is the Muslims are becoming laggards. They are growing, but they are growing in a slower speed than the normal which is for India. So, and that is where we found that the Muslims had relative disadvantage in India, and that relative disadvantage is happening over a period of time since the independence, and it is a slow process through which Muslim deprivation is taking place. And through this committee report, we brought this to the knowledge of the policymakers, and these are the evidence. And I want to show that ultimately, I gave an example of Kerala. Anybody knows the state of Kerala here is a very unique state in India, you know that. Very unique is a southern part of India. It is neighboring state to Karnataka where I was born and educated. And the Kerala is considered as a unique oasis within the Indian desert, if you want to say in quotes, because everything what happens in Kerala is very virtuous, full literacy. And you can see that evidence, this is 10-year-old data, that even the Muslim community has caught up and brought 100% literacy in Kerala. But if you go to all India levels, you do not see that happening. So, ultimately we need a situation that where every child is in school, it does not matter what caste community that, and this is a kind of level in which we need to achieve, and we could achieve that only in one state. And now the state where our friends Rashid and Haider Bhai comes from, Andhra Pradesh, and the state where I come from, which is Karnataka, which is in South India, we are reaching out to these levels. We are catching up. Okay? So, there is a lot of growth in education among the masses taking place in South India, but that is not happening. I will go back. That is not happening in North India, and this is the distribution of India, and this is India with the Muslim concentration. Okay. So, because Muslims are the laggards, we wanted to see how in which state the situation of the Muslim community is relatively worse than other community, and that is something which you know, at the end of I have another maybe 5-7 minutes. At the end we will show you how to get this report itself. You know, you can download that putting Sachar committee, and there is one report which I have displayed on my laptop, and you have all these information data readily available to you to know. So, this is the distribution of the Muslim population, and you can see the most of the Muslim population is concentrated in what is called the Indo-Gangetic plain. It is also called the cow belt. It is popularly referred to as cow belt because this is agriculture lands, you know, because of the Ganges river. So, all the activity around that for almost 2000 kilometers or more, actually 3000 kilometers, is agriculture activity, and that is where the Muslim population is also concentrated, and that is where the problem of the Muslim community is also concentrated in that area. However, there is a big rural and urban difference in terms of how the population and growth dynamics work, and that is reflected in this area. So, as opposed to the concentration of Muslims in the north belt, Muslims are by and large they live in urban areas. So, their share in urban areas is more than the share of the other communities. For example, our rate of urbanization is about 28, 29, but the share of Muslims living in urban area is about 35, 38, about 10% more. So, so if we want to address the issue of Muslim development, we have to address both the urban area and rural area, because still 65% of Muslims live in rural area, okay, but 35 live in urban area. But the fact that Muslims live in relatively more proportions in urban area, so you need to focus on Muslim development in urban areas as well as in rural areas. So, this is a unique policy advice. It is not possible to address the issue of Muslim integration, Muslim development in India without equally putting you know, your mind, your policy, which are very different. The policies will be very different in urban versus rural area. Because in rural area, to bring policy changes, you need a different kind of agriculture markets, you need different kind of linkages between the producers, farmers and the laborers. So, there is a whole range of policy, the policy about access to irrigation water, the policy with respect to access to electricity for which will be used for agriculture. So, your policy basket is very different for rural areas when compared to urban areas. So, in urban areas, we expect there is a concentration of infrastructure, there are more schools, colleges, universities in urban areas, but still you do not see Muslims going to that. So, we have a different policy basket to, we need a lot of thorough understanding of our diversity in rural and urban areas, and that is one message which I would do in terms of going back a little, so the diversity in India, which I told you about geographic diversity, and so, but there are other diversities which get, you know, occupational diversity. So, when you take different states from better developed to low developed states, there are some states which are very backward, Odisha, Madhya Pradesh, Jharkhand, Chhattisgarh, these are very, very poor pockets of India. Whereas, there are states like Punjab, there are states like Maharashtra and Gujarat, they have very high level of growth, right. So, there is a huge disparity in terms of states. Within states, then we have rural and urban disparities, which are very, very large. And then within those rural urban, we have social groups, high caste and low caste. And then we have these occupational groups, wage workers versus professionals. So can you believe the kind of diversity we have is mind boggling. So we really need, I know you are smiling, I guess that you are concurring with my with my analogy. So in a way, India is a real melting pot. So if you want to bring equity and if you want to bring broad-based growth, we need to understand these structures. Otherwise, we can't bring growth in India. These were a few things which I will skip at the moment, and now I will go straight to a bit of about, because I want to conclude by giving a note on the democratic process in India. We are very proud that India is a democracy, electoral democracy. And what better place to appreciate democracy than United States, one of the greatest democracies of the world. However, we have these national elections which happen every 5 years. But these are the days of coalition government formations. Earlier, the Congress party used to dominate until about early 90s, and then there was a opposition party which came into power. During the early period of the Congress party, the biggest opposition party was what is called the communists, ideology oriented parties. But by 1990s, the opposition party which came into power was the Hindu nationalist party called the Bharatiya Janata Dal, BJP, Bharatiya Janata Party. But after the fall of BJP, we have what is called the coalition governments. Last 20 years, our governments are based on one large party, but not adequate enough to form its own government, and then we need the support of smaller parties, which are all regional parties, and today's government is based on that. So what that means is, one regional group, we have 600 electoral member of parliaments from all over the country. The government which is formed now is based on support from parties which have 25, 22, 15 MPs. So a group of these people are supporting the party. So if any one of them withdraws the support, the government may fall. So there is a very thin razor's edge on which the Indian government can make policies today. And those people who are watching the policy changes last 2 weeks, actually, when we opened up FDI in multi-brand trade, Walmarts and Texcos, we allowed them to come in. It was a very difficult policy made, and because of that, there was a possibility of the government falling already. A political party from West Bengal, which is a regional party, withdrew support from the government. But somehow the politics is that still it is hanging on. So we really don't know when it can fall again. So the point which we are making is, the policy decision making has to take the other smaller political parties into consideration, and that is a very difficult task. So what that means is, the states, different states, we have 30 states. The states have their own political bosses, their own political. There is a DMK party in Tamil Nadu, there is BJD party in Odisha, there is a Trinamool Congress in West Bengal. So there are many different states have many these parties, and these are the parties which become coalition partners in the national government. But the important point is, in many respects, India has come of age in democracy, that the international partnerships now can be developed directly with the states. The earlier, it has to be done only through a central government. So you go and have meetings with the central government, and then you go around and find out your investment destination. Now no more. Now you can directly bypass the national, and in fact there are provision to go and do business directly with the state governments. You can go directly to Maharashtra, you can go to Andhra Pradesh, you can go to Bengal, you can go to Gujarat, and you can talk to the state level political system to do business in India.